The war on drugs was bad enough, but then the opioid crisis came along and said, hold my fucking beer.
Synthetic opioids,
opioid-related death,
fentanyl-laced heroin.
Opioid abuse in the United States is at epidemic levels.
Opioids are now the biggest drug epidemic in American history.
The opioid crisis has changed the landscape of drug addiction and drug enforcement in America. What was once a matter of prevention and punishment has become a matter of life and death. But while some rhetoric around drug policy has softened to focus more on harm reduction, the American public remains largely conservative when it comes to drug policy and resistant to many methods that are popular elsewhere. So I wanted to find out what went wrong with the war on drugs, and how much has US drug policy changed in light of the opioid crisis? What can those policies reveal about how we see addiction as a country? Have we stopped doing the things we know for sure don't work? Spoiler alert, no we haven't. And what does Trump have planned for the next phase of the war on drugs if he returns to office? This is how we're still losing the war on drugs. Roll the intro.
America's public enemy number one is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're killing our children.
They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy.
Madam President, we have predators on our streets.
Today we're going to talk about shady things happening in politics, but let me take a second to talk about shady things happening online. Have you ever tried doing a Google search of your name? I did a search of my name and found some of my personal contact information online, and I don't love that for me. The internet can create a real danger to your personal safety in a lot of ways, not least of which being the ability for anyone anywhere to find your information, either to locate you or steal your identity. And that's spooky. Data brokers sell your information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, health records, your relatives' information, it's all out there. That's why I've been using Ōra, the sponsor of today's video. Ōra shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests for me. Cleaning up my information not only helps reduce the amount of spam I get, but it protects me from hackers who could use this information to help them access my social media accounts, bank accounts, or other sensitive information. I don't know if you saw this, but AT&T recently revealed that over 73 million customer records, both existing and former customers, were released on the dark web. They recommend those affected use strong passwords, monitor account activity, and consider credit freezes or fraud alerts from credit bureaus. Well, Ōra does all this for me. And best of all, I don't have to download several different apps just because a company couldn't keep my data secure. If my info was compromised in the AT&T data breach, I wouldn't worry because Ōra is always on, always doing the hard work of keeping me safe. If protecting your privacy is something you're interested in, you can go to Ōra.com/Leeja to start your 2-week free trial, also linked below in the description. Thanks, Ōra. To figure out how we got here, we have to trace the origins of our war on drugs. So join me for a little stroll through early American drug policy. Our journey through US drug policy begins in 1909 with the passage of the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act. As the US increased contact with Asia, long notorious for its opium market, concern grew about the proliferation of a certain undesirable character in American society, the opium smoker. Opium smokers were usually Chinese laborers and white criminals, people who, as one historical account put it, were contemptuously regarded and likely to run afoul of the law. But of the estimated 300,000 opium-addicted Americans at the turn of the century, smokers were the minority. 2/3 were upper and middle-class white women who had been prescribed opium by a doctor. To be fair, this was a time when medicine was a pretty speculative endeavor and very few drugs reliably worked. Opium, though? Opium usually worked. And it became something of a prescriptive crutch, particularly when doctors were faced with complex chronic illnesses. So smoking opium equals bad, gross, nefarious, criminal. Taking opium from an unlabeled bottle delivered by your pharmacist's prepubescent errand boy? Normal. Fine. Acceptable. A useful cure for the housewife hysterics. For a little while longer, the medical brand of opium addiction would remain a mostly private matter between patient and physician. Society took a more permissive and less punitive view of opium dependence because of how quiet and gentle it seemed when compared with the main boogeyman of the day, alcohol. Where opium soothed, alcohol was inflammatory, much more likely to damage family and community, and therefore more urgently dangerous. Importantly, alcoholism was also associated with groups of suspect morality. As historian David T. Courtwright put it in his Century of American Narcotic Policy, these groups included Catholic immigrants, machine politicians, urban blacks, demi-mondanes, criminals, tramps, casual laborers, and others of the lower strata. Over and over, as we'll learn, the history of U.S. drug policy will follow this same pattern, connecting the regulation of a substance to a need to control the behavior of some group of people deemed undesirable by society. Dr. Hamilton Wright was an early master of this tactic. As chairman of the International Opium Commission, which was responsible for helping pass the 1909 Smoking Opium Exclusion Act, Wright was determined to continue strengthening restrictions. In 1912, he delivered an official report for Congress that was stuffed to the brim with bullshit statistics, including figures showing that narcotic use was outstripping population growth. It wasn't. He also exaggerated the prevalence of use among the criminals and the poors. Unfortunately, Wright's narrative won the day. His stats were widely circulated in mainstream media and even medical journals. In 1914, Congress passed the Harrison Narcotic Act, which required anyone selling or distributing narcotics to register with the federal government and pay a tax, or else face fines and up to 5 years in prison, which is a prime example of the permissiveness of drug use in the early 20th century. 5 years in prison for narcotic sales is child's play by today's standards. And there was an exception for unregistered persons who'd been prescribed narcotics as medicine in good faith by a physician, dentist, or veterinary surgeon who was registered. Opium from your vet? A-okay. Nothing to see here. Interestingly, the Harrison Act defined narcotics as opium and coca-based drugs, which are medicinally distinct. One is a downer, one is an upper. They're fundamentally different, but they were combined legislatively, according to Cartwright's account, because of the assumption that both were euphorogenic, potentially habit-forming, and associated with crime. It was for similar reasons that marijuana would also later be described as a narcotic. Because the Harrison Act was a tax law, enforcement fell to the Treasury Department, specifically the Bureau of Internal Revenue's Miscellaneous Division, which was also responsible for control over oleomargarine, adulterated butter, filled cheese, mixed flour, and cotton futures. 162 federal narcotics agents were hired, invited to design their own badges, and set loose to start arresting doctors and pharmacists. Within a year, the agents had seized 44 pounds of opium and secured 100 convictions. The maximum sentence for narcotic possession was 10 years in prison. So the anti-narcotics industry was officially puttering along, but it would continue to be dwarfed by the temperance movement, which was throwing all its weight into abolishing alcohol nationwide. Sure, narcotics enforcers got 2 cute pieces of legislation, but on January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment made prohibition the law of the land. As we all know, prohibition worked amazingly. Alcoholism magically stopped being a thing, and nobody went blind or died trying to make bathtub moonshine. Just kidding, it was a mess, and it led to the rise of organized crime in America. While gangs brought in big bucks on the back of prohibition, the government's so-called dry agents were not so prosperous. The understaffed, underpaid group of mostly veterans faced public vitriol and resentment from politicians at every level of government. According to the DEA, the prohibition unit eventually became little more than a training ground for bootleggers. Imagine that, the people tasked with restricting the flow of a drug discover that it's more profitable to become part of the pipeline. Where have I seen that before? Anyway, prohibition proved to be virtually unenforceable, and some very wealthy, powerful people, including chemical manufacturing mogul Pierre DuPont and newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, campaigned for repeal through the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, which created national propaganda and public pressure for the cause. And then in 1929, the stock market crashed, and all the sweet, sweet tax revenue that prohibition was leaving on the table became too tasty to pass up. Once the financial pressure hit, it was just a hop, skip, and a jump to ending national prohibition. The 21st Amendment was ratified on December 5th, 1933. As prohibition hemorrhaged support, narcotics enforcement was shaping up to be a valuable revenue center in its own right. At least partly to distinguish narcotics enforcement from its unpopular cousin, prohibition, in 1930, President Herbert Hoover created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics within the Department of the Treasury. The inaugural Commissioner of Narcotics, or the Drug Czar as the position has come to be unofficially known, was Harry J. Anslinger. He would hold the post for more than 3 decades decades, under 4 different presidents. At Anslinger's urging, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, bringing marijuana under the Bureau of Narcotics jurisdiction. The new law levied a tax on the sale of hemp, cannabis, or marijuana, which, left unpaid, could land a person with up to $2,000 in fines and 5 years in prison. Anslinger was a prolific fearmonger and used the established anti-narcotic playbook. He played up the association between the substance, in this case marijuana, and an internal minority, in this case Mexicans, claiming the drug caused those users to go insane and become prone to violent, unpredictable behavior. Later, Anslinger leaned more heavily into the pot as a gateway drug narrative, claiming in testimony to Congress in 1951 that over 50% of those young addicts started on marijuana smoking. They started there and graduated to heroin. This is a classic example of mistaking correlation for causation, but that requires critical thinking and an understanding of stats, which is so hard. So the gateway drug theory stuck. In the wake of World War II, people were buying into the gateway drug story just as the prevailing racial stereotype of the narcotic addict was changing from a white or Oriental person to a black male. According to Cartwright's history, not only were black addicts turning up more often in federal treatment centers, but they were being booked more frequently by the police, to the point that by the 1950s, half or more of all narcotic arrests involved black people. Something similar was happening in the Hispanic communities. That something similar was systemic racism, 1,000 uncoordinated yet ideologically aligned policies designed to preserve white supremacy. Redline lending, white flight, urban decay, intergenerational drug trafficking and use, and cyclical poverty. But instead of addressing any of the clear underlying socioeconomic factors contributing to rampant drug use, Anslinger focused on enforcement. He believed that with tough enough sanctions, he could choke the supply of illicit drugs and stamp out the whole nasty business at the source. You can see this flawed logic persist to this day in our border policies aimed at stamping out fentanyl, which are also not working, but we'll get to that. In 1951 and 1956, respectively, the Boggs Act and the Narcotic Control Act introduced progressively stiffer mandatory sentences for possession and sale. Many states were even inspired to pass Little Boggs laws, establishing their own mandatory sentences in cases where they felt punishment should be even more severe than the federal minimum, or where federal law had not yet established sentencing guidelines. One Louisiana statute from 1956 provided mandatory sentences of up to 99 years for anyone who sold, possessed, or administered narcotics. Around the same time, possession of marijuana was punishable by 2 years to life in prison. By the early 60s, the Bureau of Narcotics was a force to be reckoned with, but what Cartwright calls a Vietnam-like disillusionment had begun to set in. Despite decades of escalating sanctions, narcotics were still finding their way onto the streets of America's cities. The U.S. has 88,633 miles of tidal shoreline and 2 long borders to the north and south, and narcotics are very small. Just 2 kilos in a false bottom suitcase is worth a small fortune. The better the Bureau got at catching narcotics, the larger the risk of trafficking became, the higher the price of narcotics rose, the greater the incentive for traffickers to keep trying. In 1962, Anslinger reached the mandatory age of retirement, and his deputy, Henry L. Giordano, succeeded him, releasing a statement acknowledging that the Bureau of Narcotics subscribes completely to the view that the federal government does not consider drug addiction a crime. So if a person was addicted to a drug but refrained from procuring, having, or using it, no harm, no foul. And this was the beginning of a brief Rehabilitate the Individual campaign driven by liberals. In 1963, JFK established the President's Advisory Commission on Narcotic and Drug Abuse, which promised to attack the illegal traffic of drugs with the full power of the law, but to rehabilitate addicted individuals, even against their will. The 1960s saw the Narcotics Bureau make big busts all around the world while fighting what was becoming an increasingly cultural war at home. As the baby boomers began coming of age and charting the middle-class pothead to psychedelic enthusiast trajectory, Anslinger's earlier warnings rang hollow. Pot was not turning them into violent monsters as their parents, teachers, and other authority figures had always promised. What? So then what else was Anslinger lying about? By the end of the 1960s, the era of free love and liberal drug use was in full swing, brutally juxtaposed against the 15 to 20% of veterans returning from Vietnam self-medicating severe PTSD with heroin. All of a sudden, America's drug problem felt like it was spinning out of control. On April 7th, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson proposed Reorganization Plan No. 1, calling for combining previously separate narcotics bureaus into a single Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Former Charlotte, North Carolina Police Chief John E. Ingersoll became the director, and the real war on drugs officially began. In 1970, President Nixon signed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, which combined all previous federal drug laws into one. Title II of the Controlled Substances Act introduced the 5 schedules classifying drugs based on their medical usefulness versus risk for addiction and abuse. Schedule I drugs, those considered a high risk for abuse with no accepted medical use, included heroin, which was first introduced as a medicine, marijuana, now widely prescribed as a medicine, and ecstasy, which is showing promise as a PTSD treatment. Once again, the groupings had less to do with the proven, well-studied chemical consequences of the drugs themselves, and more to do with how eager the government was to restrict their flow and, consequently, the people buying, selling, and using them. In June 1971, President Nixon declared that drug abuse was public enemy number 1, and officially kicked off what we think of as America's concerted war on drugs. Shortly after, Nixon passed an executive order creating the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention, tasked with managing drug treatment, rehabilitation, prevention, education, and training programs. 𝗖𝗢𝗡𝗘𝗧𝗧's first director, Dr. Jerome Jaffe, was a vocal advocate for using methadone to treat heroin addiction, and according to Cartwright, between June 1971 and March 1973, the number of federally funded methadone patients doubled. But methadone, a maintenance-based approach to treating addiction that didn't hurry towards a foregone conclusion of abstinence, was politically controversial at best. Clinics fought the government for funding, and neighborhoods fought the government over zoning. Robert Newman, who led the expansion of methadone clinics in New York City between 1970 and 1974, described the intensity of community opposition. There was the hatred and the concern regarding addicts and addiction. It's a lot of things. It's race and class, it's fear, the realization that addicts have to commit crimes to support their habit, and it's a resentment that people are feeling that good 3, 4, 5 times a day. It's hard to express this hostility because there's nothing to focus against, but a methadone clinic brought all these problems together. It was a building in front of which you could picket or wheel your baby carriages or go to the press about. I think people really wanted to express their hostility against a problem that was so evanescent that they couldn't do it in any other way. Though treatment was an early priority for Nixon, he eventually leaned into law and order to attract Southern, more conservative voters. On March 28, 1973, Nixon declared an all-out global war on the drug menace and created a brand new enforcement agency, the DEA. Its first administrator stated 2 foundational goals: to integrate narcotics agents and U.S. Customs agents into one effective force, and to restore public confidence in narcotics law enforcement. The new super agency consisted of 1,470 agents and had a nearly $75 million budget. 2 years later, those figures had nearly doubled. And yet, drug use in America continued to escalate. By the mid-1970s, Miami had become the drug capital of the Western Hemisphere, and the region was quickly overwhelmed by violent cocaine and marijuana traffickers, mostly from Latin America. As drugs poured into the U.S., the culture around marijuana and even cocaine became casual. They were seen by many as harmless recreational drugs, usually enjoyed by college students who would soon enough get back in line and transition into good little corporate yuppies. In 1977, Jimmy Carter became president after campaigning on a promise to decriminalize marijuana. But then in 1979, he asked the DEA to draft a model anti-drug paraphernalia law that state and local governments could adopt to make the possession of paraphernalia a crime. According to the DEA, by mid-1981, 20 states had enacted the agency's Model Drug Paraphernalia Act. Drug use peaked in 1979 and then began to fall, but declining drug use didn't prevent the highly racialized moral panic around the so-called crack epidemic from spiraling out of control. They used to talk about crack the way we talk about bath salts today, a similarly wild, terrifying unpredictability. People on bath salts are eating people's faces, that kind of thing. That was the vibe. Crack was sometimes called the devil's drug, and it was believed to be instantly addictive and the cause of seemingly random violence. In her 2023 paper on the evolution of the drug war, 𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 writes, sensationalist media accounts and early scientific reports stoked fears of a new generation of severely disabled crack babies in need of costly medical care for the rest of their lives. These apocalyptic claims turned out to be unfounded. Crack and crackheads became the scapegoats onto which politicians, other public figures, and even some residents of poor African-American neighborhoods heaped much of the blame for rising rates of violence, crime, and social decay in urban areas, much as they had blamed heroin and heroin addicts in the 1960s and 1970s. If you bought into the moral panic, which a lot of people did, it made sense to invest in law enforcement, including militarized police, and really push law and order in poor urban neighborhoods. The the same neighborhoods Reagan pulled the social safety net out from under in the 1980s, fueled by a separate but related moral panic about welfare queens gaming the system. So on one hand, investing in enforcement, and on the other, divesting from public housing, education, and healthcare, plus regressive taxes, residential segregation, anything that might actually help keep kids off drugs, that got cut. 𝗏𝗧𝗡𝗏 explains that the crack crisis was a moral panic that created a law enforcement crisis for poor urban communities as police officers behaved like an occupying army, emboldened by a slew of new federal and state drug laws, legal decisions, and public policies that fostered dangerous and intrusive policing tactics. And if you heard the rumor that the CIA helped flood its own cities with crack, you're not entirely misinformed. While all of this was happening at home, the CIA was also actively working to support Nicaraguan guerrilla armies in an attempt to overthrow that country's communist government. Those well-funded, well-armed armies, thanks to the CIA, then in turn smuggled a fuck ton of cocaine into the US, which helped fuel the crack epidemic. So while the government wasn't exactly handing out free samples on American city corners, its actions definitely helped reinforce the narrative being peddled at the time. And there was no greater peddler of drug-related fear-mongering in the 1980s than Ronald fucking Reagan himself. Ronald Reagan made the war on drugs his top priority throughout his presidency. He would reportedly start every cabinet meeting by having each person go around and answer the question, "What are you doing about drugs?" This was an unprecedented level of follow-up from the president. Reagan didn't mention any other subject so consistently, not even his Star Wars project. Early in his tenure, Reagan outlined several goals for the drug war in a speech at a police conference in New Orleans. He said he wanted to inject the military into the war on drugs, get the FBI involved, and spray herbicides on drug crops all over the world, which he got his way on, by the way. He also wanted to more or less eliminate bail and parole, and most of all, he wanted to get rid of the pesky exclusionary rule, a well-established tenet of criminal law which says that evidence obtained in violation of the Constitution cannot be used against someone in court. Basically, it's the part that says the Constitution also applies to law enforcement. But Reagan was like, hell nah. In 1984, Nancy and Ronald Reagan appeared together before the nation to introduce the First Lady's Zero Tolerance, Just Say No campaign. The best origin story that the Reagan Foundation could come up with was a name for her cause was chosen after she met with school children in Oakland. A little girl raised her hand, she remembered, and said, "Mrs. Reagan, what do you do if somebody offers you drugs?" And I said, "Well, you just say no." And there it was born. I think people thought we had an advertising agency over who dreamed that up. Not true. So there you have it. Nancy Reagan, ad man. Nancy peddled her genius campaign in elementary schools around the country. Reportedly, the crusade made serious demands on her time, 110 appearances and 14 anti-drug speeches in 1984 alone. Her intense effort to fight school-age drug and alcohol abuse took her to 65 cities in 33 states and 9 foreign countries. She also invited the spouses of 24 heads of state to a 3-day anti-drug forum in Washington and Atlanta. Sounds like a fucking drag, frankly. So there you have it, Nancy Reagan throws bad parties. Nancy's reign as First Lady coincided with the warm embrace of DARE across the country. Drug abuse resistance education was the brainchild of Los Angeles Police Department Chief Daryl Gates and the Los Angeles Unified School District. The idea was pair up police officers with students, create relationships that buffer against drug use, gang affiliation, and violence. At its height, DARE was in as many as 75% of U.S. school districts. Did you have to take the DARE pledge to stay away from drugs and gangs at a weird assembly in like 4th and 6th grade where they showed you briefcases full of drugs and pictures of rotten teeth? And where decades after it first hit the mainstream, you were still taught that marijuana was a gateway drug to worse and more powerful substances? This may come as a shock, but DARE, like the war on drugs, did not work. Well, it didn't work to prevent drug abuse. Studies have shown that it may have actually backfired on that front, but DARE and its 3 R's, recognize, resist, and report, did successfully normalize police presence in schools and turn a generation of students into police informants, which some argue may have been at least part of the point. Yikes. The Ronald Tough on Drugs Reagan 1980s was an era ripe for an ambitious, new school tough on crime Democrat to shine. And that's where new Senator Joseph R. Biden was ready to make his mark. He was behind the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 88, which included $1.7 billion to fight the drug war, or really buy new toys for law enforcement, increased penalties for transporting drugs, established yet another federal office, this time the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and included harsh sentences for anyone found distributing drugs that led to the death or serious injury of a person. Harsh as in mandatory minimums of 20 years up to a life sentence, as well as fines of up to $2 million. Harsh. That policy is sometimes known as the 𝗦𝗪𝗧𝗏 law, named for the 22-year-old basketball player who died tragically of a cocaine-induced heart attack in 1986, while the first of the anti-drug abuse acts was being considered. It's a bitter irony that the loss of a young black man helped pass the policy that would lead to the losses of so many more young black men. The most important change the anti-drug abuse acts made was to create mandatory minimums for drug offenses, notably with a huge sentencing disparity between powder cocaine and crack. Powder cocaine, more associated with white users, carried a 5-year mandatory minimum for distribution or possession of up to 500 grams, while crack, which was more affordable and associated with black users, carried the same sentence for just 5 grams of crack, a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. These laws mark a key acceleration period in the history of mass incarceration, particularly of people of color, particularly black men in America. Before the 1986 Act, the average federal drug sentence for African Americans was 11% higher than for white offenders. By 1990, the average federal drug sentence for African Americans was 49% higher. The national prison population exploded under Ronald Reagan. His iteration of the war on drugs was directly responsible for the mass incarceration that has devastated entire generations. In 1980, 50,000 people were in prison for nonviolent drug crimes. By 1997, there were more than 400,000 nonviolent drug offenders in custody. Before the turn of the 21st century, the pattern was already clear, but it took decades for the government to address the problem. It wasn't until 2010, the same year that Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, came out and educated mainstream audiences about mass incarceration in the US, that President Obama signed the Fair Sentencing Act, reducing the sentencing ratio between crack and cocaine to 18-to-1 and eliminating the 5-year mandatory minimum for simple possession. The sentencing reduction could have been passed when it was initially suggested in 1995 by the U.S. Sentencing Commission, but Congress was still enjoying its tough-on-crime era too much to be bothered. So for the first time in its history, in 1995, Congress overrode the U.S. Sentencing Commission's recommendation and kept the mandatory minimums in place. 1995 was a busy time, and while the U.S. Congress was busy applying tough law and order to crackheads and heroin addicts, the Food and Drug Administration approved a new semi-synthetic opioid manufactured by Purdue Pharma, Oxycontin. Despite Purdue and the FDA's claims that Oxycontin and other new formulations of oxycodone were super safe and definitely not addictive, they were in fact highly addictive and prone to misuse. Drug companies explicitly targeted white people in rural and suburban communities for many reasons, one of which being that in the medical community, white pain is prioritized while black pain is questioned and downplayed, creating a situation in which medical racism may have inadvertently protected minorities from the ravages of overprescription of oxy. Before long, Oxycontin was selling more than $1 billion worth of pills every year, as tens of thousands of people died every year from opioid overdoses. The difference between an opiate and an opioid is that an opiate comes from the plant, while an opioid is synthesized in a lab. Opioids are easier to hide, cheaper to make, and a lot more potent than their natural counterparts. And it's this transition from opiates like heroin to opioids like Oxycontin and later fentanyl that marks another significant turning point in America's ever-evolving drug policy. Interest in treating addiction slowly and steadily grew as the opioid crisis intensified, especially within white communities, you know, the ones people actually care about treating like humans instead of just presumptive criminals. George W. Bush kept federal dollars flowing in the direction of law enforcement, but would every now and then pepper in mention of the need for more treatment support. Once Obama became president, he sidestepped the opioid epidemic as long as possible. In 2009, his administration signaled it would be retiring the term war on drugs because of its counterproductive and antagonistic rhetoric towards users. In 2010, the government did the only thing it seems to know how to do with drug policy and choked off the once plentiful supply of opioids by cracking down on pill mills, instituting prescription monitoring programs, and imposing restrictions on how many pain pills doctors were permitted to prescribe and to whom. Without treatment options readily available, the hordes of people who had become dependent on opioids turned to illegal street drugs, specifically heroin, which carried enormous risks for overdose and needle-borne diseases like HIV and hepatitis C. And then around 2015, fentanyl started showing up in the street drug supply. A synthetic opioid 50 times more potent than heroin, fentanyl was getting sprinkled sold into heroin and also unrelated products like MDMA. Users who survived their first encounter were quickly hooked, a lucrative opportunity for the dealer. Fentanyl wears off ridiculously fast. Where a hit of heroin might take hours to wear off, a fentanyl high vanishes in 15 minutes. This is one of the qualities that made fentanyl a useful medical drug when it came to market as an anesthetic in the 1960s. Overdose deaths nearly doubled during Obama's tenure, yet he waited until his final 16 months in office to speak about the opioid crisis directly. In July 2016, Obama signed the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. Despite being hyped as the first major federal addiction legislation in 40 years, it had barely made it through Congress and wound up being a modest bill with minimal funding that expanded access to maintenance treatments like methadone, still the most proven and effective treatment for opioid use disorder. Obama also got the Cures Act passed. It was mostly a pharmaceutical lobbyist-crafted monster, which is why everyone was told to focus on the $1 billion in funding that it set aside for treating the opioid crisis. And it's pretty wild that we live in a world where $1 billion is an insulting amount of money, but it was truly a paltry amount compared to the scope of the crisis. To make matters worse, a lot of states put that money into arresting opioid users instead of treating them. This despite consistent research and decades of proof showing that tougher sentences and other punitive measures don't reduce and may in fact increase the harms associated with substance use disorder. In his 2016 campaign, Trump harped on the opioid crisis a great deal, both as justification for his anti-immigrant border policies and by claiming he would declare a national emergency and deploy FEMA to address the opioid crisis. Trump's lip service to opioid treatment policy earned him support on the campaign trail, especially in areas hit hardest by the crisis. But once in office, President Trump failed to follow through on that whole national emergency thing. Instead, in October 2017, he declared the opioid epidemic to be a public health emergency, making an additional $57,000 available to address the crisis. $57,000 shakes out to less than $1 for each overdose death in the US that year alone. Other efforts were equally uninspiring. Trump's President's Commission on Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis wound up repeating many of Obama's Surgeon General's reports. But while acknowledging substance abuse as a disease and recommending expanded treatment, it also called for increased law enforcement, specifically stepping up penalties for trafficking fentanyl. Perpetuating this mixed messaging, Trump then nominated a leading defender of the opioid industry to become the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy's new so-called drug czar, which caused a political shitstorm leading to the nominee's withdrawal. In October 2018, Trump signed the Support Act, which authorized $3.3 billion over the next decade to stem the opioid crisis, another insultingly paltry sum that pales in comparison to the level of need. In January 2019, the Senate finally confirmed that the Trump administration's first permanent drug czar, a former counsel to the Ford Motor Company named James Carroll. With Carroll in place, the Office of National Drug Control Policy released a 20-page outline of drug policy that sounded like it could have been plucked from the pages of Reagan's Just Say No campaigns. Yet again, instead of focusing on treatment or prevention, the report focused on the border wall and even increased vigilance overseas as critical steps to halt the opioid epidemic. And it's honestly mind-boggling that these politicians have tried the same thing over and over and over and keep coming to the same trash conclusion. In December 2018, Trump signed the First Step Act, which reduced penalties for several drug offenses and was celebrated as a bipartisan win. But it included a sentencing enhancement for selling fentanyl. Between 2014 and 2018, the number of people convicted of fentanyl-related offenses under federal drug trafficking laws increased by nearly 5,000%. And a study from the U.S. Sentencing Committee in 2018 found that, as with the crack epidemic, low-level Black and Latino offenders were finding themselves disproportionately ensnared by harsher fentanyl sanctions. Once again, instead of bringing the war to the source, the actual traffickers or the society that drives people to seek escape through hard drug use, the government is caught up in incarcerating its own people, many of whom are both victims and perpetrators, people selling drugs primarily to maintain their own habits. There's a narrative that more emphasis has been given to harm reduction during the opioid epidemic than the crack epidemics, and speculation that the perceived softening has to do with the racial demographics of who has been most impacted by the crisis. While it's true that the opioid epidemic started among white people who were being overprescribed painkillers, we've come a long way since then. These days, it's almost impossible to get street drugs without fentanyl in them, so the opioid epidemic has the potential to touch any person using any illicit substance. In 2023, 81,000 people in the US died from an opioid overdose. What we're experiencing for the first time is actually a true drug use epidemic. Remember, crack and the crack epidemic was more of a moral panic than a medical crisis. Obviously, crack addiction is still a serious issue, but unlike the crack panic of the 1980s, today, most Americans know someone, or at least know someone who has been directly harmed by opioids. These drugs are also far deadlier than any substance our country has faced before. Harm reduction didn't just become more prevalent because people look down on white users less than people of color who use drugs. Harm reduction has become more prevalent because without interventions like Narcan, people just die. There is far less time to get them help or for the law and order types to lock them up because they're dying too fast to get to rehab or prison. So it's less about rehabilitation or incarceration and more about harm reduction in the form of helping fewer people die. The stakes are incredibly high. And as I said, the fentanyl high lasts 15 minutes, requiring far more doses to maintain a longer high, only ratcheting up the risks and the challenges for people trying to make sure that victims of addiction survive long enough to form a long-term recovery strategy. In November 2020, Oregon voters passed Measure 110, decriminalizing the possession of small amounts of drugs, even the hard ones like meth, heroin, and fentanyl. Hundreds of millions of dollars were earmarked for treatment and a health-based approach to addiction and overdose. In March 2024, the Oregon State Legislature proposed a new law to repeal Measure 110. Despite the best intentions of all involved, implementation was a mess, and results were underwhelming. A recent report from the Center for Justice Innovation found that Oregon took this hands-off approach under the guise of letting the community lead. But there needs to be infrastructural support, foundational education. There was incredibly poor meeting facilitation, so the group did not mesh from the beginning. We wanted to fund small, grassroots, community-based organizations, BIPOC organizations, but then with 21 cooks in the kitchen, we ended up creating a behemoth grant application. And remember, all this is happening with COVID just humming along in the background, exacerbating loneliness, homelessness, and drug use. Research has found no direct association between Measure 110 and changes in crime. The crime rate is actually declining nationwide, including in Portland, Oregon, but it's not because of Measure 110. Because of the failure in Oregon, the pendulum is already swinging back to the law and order logic, despite data showing that spending more money on policing doesn't make cities safer either. And what better place to focus on law and order than at the borders? Most of the fentanyl in the US originates in China, where chemical precursors are manufactured and then shipped to Mexico. From there, 90% of it is smuggled into the US at official ports of entry by American citizens. Let me just say that one more time. 90% of fentanyl from Mexico is smuggled in at official ports of entry by red-blooded American citizens. Still, Republicans believe the fantasy that the opioid epidemic is caused by fentanyl being smuggled in illegally across the border by Mexicans in the dead of night coming to take advantage of the poor lost souls in America. And then Fox News whips people into a frenzy over this made-up fairy tale to help push the nationalist narrative that immigrants are bad and only bring drugs and crime, even though that's been proven to be false time and again. So the focus shifts from treatment and prevention to law, order, and border enforcement, which is why America's modern drug war is going about as well as it did in the 1980s. In 2021, Biden extended a 2018 DEA order that created class-wide scheduling of fentanyl analogs that replicated the crack cocaine-style disparity in mandatory sentences. Analogs are drugs that closely resemble fentanyl but may have one tiny thing different between their chemical structures, allowing manufacturers to skirt regulations. In 2019, the median sentence for offenders convicted of crimes involving fentanyl analogs was about 2 years longer than crimes involving pure fentanyl. Just like during the crack era, prosecutions for fentanyl analogs have disproportionately targeted Black people. 40% of people convicted of fentanyl-related crimes and almost 60% of those convicted of fentanyl analog-related crimes are Black. According to the Sentencing Commission, from 2016 to 2019, people prosecuted and convicted of fentanyl analog crimes increased by 5,725%. So while it's true that President Biden has said he wants to repeal mandatory minimums and undo the legacy of the war on drugs that, I'll remind you, he helped craft in the 1980s, his policies have been pretty run-of-the-mill. The Drug Policy Alliance criticized Biden's 2024 State of the Union address for correctly identifying identifying the problems without committing to known solutions, calling on the president to scale up and support life-saving overdose prevention services, including greater access to the overdose reversal drug Narcan, drug checking tools like fentanyl test strips, syringe service programs, and overdose prevention centers. Harsh fentanyl penalties do not decrease the drug supply, but they will make illicit drug use more dangerous and deadly. Naturally, both Biden and Trump remain preoccupied with unsuccessfully keeping drugs out of the country rather than meaningfully addressing the myriad social causes of drug abuse. For Trump's part, he's still out there promising to give drug traffickers the death penalty, the classic iron-fisted, air-headed kind of statement he's been making for years at this point. Project 2025's Mandate for Leadership plan mentions opioids just 3 times. The first mention is in the section of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or ONDCP, which lays out the addiction crisis and immediately transitions into talking about the border. The next administration must reaffirm a commitment to preventing drug use before it starts, providing treatment that leads to long-term recovery and reducing the availability of illicit drugs in the United States. The drug trafficking environment is exponentially more dynamic and dangerous today than it was just 5 years ago, as powerful synthetic opioids, fentanyl and its analogs, are mixed into other drugs of abuse. What is that? A Project 2025 stance I can agree with? Drug trafficking organizations are extremely nimble and able to adapt quickly to federal government actions and changes in user behavior. Disrupting the flow of drugs across our borders and into our communities is of paramount importance, both to save lives and to bolster our public health efforts. For these reasons, the director of ONDCP should make it a point to consult with federal border enforcement officials. Oh, got it. So no solutions, just immigrants are bad because drugs. Got it. Beyond that, Project 2025 calls for the gutting of the ONDCP as part of an overall destruction of the administrative state, writing, "The president must ensure that the ONDCP is managed by political appointees who are committed to the administration's agenda and not acquiesce to management by political or career military personnel who oversaw the prior administration's ONDCP." The final mention of opioids comes from a section on securing the border, because of course it does. It is critical that the federal government staunch the flow of drugs by preventing the far too easy access to the United States that now exists. There can be no serious dispute that the Biden administration has opened the southwest border to whomever wants to enter, and that some of those entrants are smuggling fentanyl into the country. Right, except there can be a serious dispute because 1, Biden's immigration policy has become about as bad as Trump's, and 2, the part where 90% of fentanyl from Mexico is smuggled in at official ports of entry by red-blooded American citizens. According to a recent poll, more than half of Americans now put reducing the availability of illegal drugs at the top of their issues list when considering who to vote for this November. The implications of this could be profound, especially in swing states where the fentanyl crisis has become the single most important issue. A Bloomberg Morning Consult poll of nearly 5,000 voters in 7 swing states found that fentanyl misuse was very or somewhat important to 77% of voters. But it seems like both options in November are going to do a pretty comparably shit job either way, especially given that Biden seems to be leaning into strong border control policy to try to appeal to voters in those swing states ahead of November. Plus his shit track record when it comes to the war on drugs since the 1980s. So it appears that, for the foreseeable future, our elected officials will continue to lean into the law and order tactics that have been proven repeatedly for over 50 years at this point to be completely ineffective in the war on drugs. Which brings us to mutual aid. When your government fails you, you gotta at least watch out for each other. First and foremost, get familiar with the signs of an overdose, which may include unconsciousness or unresponsiveness, doesn't wake up when shaken or called, shallow breathing, limpness, blue lips, gums, or fingertips, slow or irregular heartbeat or pulse. Then get trained to use Narcan, also known as naloxone, and keep some on you at all times. Bonus points if you can afford extra to give out. Naloxone is a life-saving medicine that comes as an injectable or as a nose spray. It can rapidly reverse an opioid overdose and return a person's breathing to normal by attaching to opioid receptors in the brain and blocking the effects of opioids. When administered in a timely fashion, the person overdosing will typically wake up within 1 to 3 minutes, but may require additional doses. If you give someone naloxone, it's recommended that you call 911 and stay with them to keep them awake and breathing until help arrives. If they don't regain consciousness, you can give them more doses, and you should lay the person on their side to keep them from choking. This is the part where I remind you that abusing drugs reduces a person's access to their frontal lobe, meaning that they are prone to behaving more impulsively and less rationally than the average person. So from your perspective, having your life saved with naloxone would be a categorically good thing. But for someone who just had their expensive high ruined, who now won't be able to get high again for a while because of the medication, waking up might be a nasty surprise. All that to say, be mindful and don't necessarily get in anyone's face expecting a hug, a thank you, and a quick skip off to the nearest treatment center, okay? Addiction is tenuous, unpredictable, and heartbreaking at times. And addressing the drug abuse problem in our country is going to be a lot bigger than simply cutting off supply and putting everyone who's ever touched drugs in prison. We need to cut off desire. That desire forms through a combination of social and genetic factors so complex that breaking through can feel impossible. Look for mutual aid organizations in your area that focus on serving people in addiction and see how you can help. I bet a bunch of them are already organizing naloxone trainings that you can attend. Shout out to my newest supporters on Patreon, as well as supporters in my royal tiers, and a very special shout out to my multi-platinum supporters, 𝗬𝗓 Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, Tay, and Brett Piontek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. If you like this video, you'll also enjoy my uplifting banger about mass incarceration. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.